Hi everyone, it's Karen Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. Thanks for joining me today for a webinar on the House Transportation Bill. It's called the INVEST Act, and I'm going to talk about what's in it for bicycling and walking in livable communities. So just as we start off, I just want to recognize the protests going on and just reiterate at least a little bit of the League statement that we know that safe streets for everyone means more than bike lanes and sidewalks, and that our work is tied into racial equity and the inequities that are happening now. The picture on the side of the frame is a picture of 16th Street in Washington, D.C. It's about a half mile from our, not a half block from our office, and a block from the White House. And that's the city staff of Planet have painted Black Lives Matter on that. Okay, so I'm gonna transition now into the bill. Please let me, if you have any questions, please put them in the question box. And I can see that people can hear me and see the slides. So great, we're ready to go. So I'm going to talk through what's in the bill. I'm going to talk in a little more detail about what's on the transportation alternatives, what's in safety for biking and walking, do a little on performance measures, climate change, other highway programs, and then some NHTSA programs that we've been watching that have to do both with the behavior side on transportation and also automated vehicles. So looking at the overall bill, INVEST stands for Investing in a New Vision for the Environment and Surface Transportation in America Act. And there's just some real major themes that you'll see as I go through this. First of all, climate really is infused throughout the bill, and greenhouse gas emission reduction is now basically a goal of almost every transportation program. They also really drilled in on that idea of connectivity and that our transportation system should create access to jobs and services across all modes. They're also really looking at performance management and how to hold states accountable. And then I would say vulnerable user safety is also high up there on the list. When we're talking about process, so the bill that went out, it is a Democrat-only bill led by Chairman DeFazio in the House. It has a lot of systematic change to it. Right now, DeFazio was quoted as saying he doesn't know that he could get enough Democratic votes to get it past the House. It changes things that much. So we want to support this bill. There's a lot of great things in it, but his process now, now that it's out there, it's going to be out there for almost 2 weeks, enough time to start negotiations with T&I Republicans, so that we'll see a lot of amendments to it. It's also time for us to work with our champions to think about, are there other things we want that we can amend to put in there? And so I just want to tag and ask people to watch for action alerts coming from the League of American Bicyclists. That bottom is our action alert site, bikeleague.org/takeaction. We may have some amendments coming up in the next 10 days or so. And that 10 days is important because June 17th is when there's going to be a committee markup. That's when all of the amendments will get voted on. That's why they say marked up. They may add an amendment here. They may add in language there. After they've done with the amendments, they'll vote on it and they'll pass the bill. And so then we'll have a transportation bill. In late June, the Ways and Means Committee will have to pass their own financing bill, so that a full transportation bill takes the policy one that the Transportation Committee did with the finance one, which the Ways and Means Committee does, puts it together. It's a full bill. So Ways and Means Committee will have to act. That's where we're hoping to include the Bicycle Commuter Act. So watch for alerts and action on that. And then the goal is in late June or July for the whole House to vote on this bill and hopefully for it to pass. Just looking at the funding, it's a significant increase from where we are now. brings the highway programs up to 319 billion. I want to say it's about 250 now for 5 years. This would be for 5 years, so that's a significant increase. 105 for federal transit and 60 billion for rail. Two big things there. Rail is included. Also, for the last 30 years, we've had the funding has been 80% highway, 20% transit. This brings the transit side up to 25%. So another thing, what they did with this bill is they wanted to do all these new programs. They wanted to get those implemented as soon as possible. But given what's happening with COVID and the economic hardship, the committee decided that for the first year, they're just going to do a flat extension of the FAST Act, but use that new money to make it 100% federal match. And the reason they did that is because it takes a while to get new programs going. So this way, USDOT will have a year to get the new programs up to date, but states and local governments will be able to spend transportation dollars as stimulus and get things done during that first year. They also have additional money that's available just to keep everyone at the transit agencies, at the state and local DOTs working and employed, and also the operating assistants. I'm going to just look quickly at FHWA to see what those numbers mean for the federal highway programs. Most of those programs are going to see about a 15% increase. The surface transportation program, which for the last few years we've been calling the surface transportation block grant program, that's the most flexible program. It's one that the states like the most. It's where transportation alternative sits. That program's going up to 18% by 18%. Transportation alternatives is going to see an increase of about 60%. And the recreational trails program will see an increase of 175%. So definitely some good news in that. So I'm going to talk about biking and walking provisions and looking at the league's priorities. They basically took everything we wanted in transportation alternatives. So we're giving them 5 bicycles for that. We thought that was great. That we want some system change in how they do safety funding. We got part of what we want in that. Give it 3 bicycles. We both want the same thing. We have some ideas on how to do it. For those of you who've been to the summit, first of all of the things in red have been summit asks, and we got those. So thank you to everyone who's been to the summit. We have been talking about the Commute Act to get access data to communities. They went beyond that. There's a lot more about making sure that there's accessibility to biking and walking. So that's in there. There's also a lot of great climate programs. In the Senate bill, we had gotten a small program for biking and walking and resilience. That's not in there, but overall, the climate section is really good for biking. There's a section on new technologies and AV safety. It's not the changes to the AV bill that we want because that's a different committee, but they do have some good language there. We had also hoped to get a set aside in federal lands. We did not get that, but there's some good news for federal lands. All right, moving into transportation alternatives. Okay. There, good. So this is the bread and butter of biking and walking. More than 50% of all the funds that go to biking and walking now come from this program. This is how the program works right now under the FAST Act. We are capped at $850 million. That gets broken down among the states. The Rec Trails program comes off the top. The rest of the money goes into 2 pots. One goes into a state competitive process, so that's an all areas competition. The other half goes into goes into a population pot, which is divided into 3 sizes of communities, and then competitive processes are run through each of those. And right now, states can transfer 50% out. So we asked for 3 things: funding changes, state flexibility, and local control. For the funding changes, we wanted to change that 850 to a percentage and get a bump for that. So we want 10% of the surface transportation block grant program or the surface transportation program. We also wanted to change the relationship between population and state. So we want 2/3 in the population. That does a couple of things. It gives the large MPOs, they get a bigger chunk, but there's also a bigger chunk that's set aside for the really small communities under 5,000. So what they did on this is showing current law, what our ask was, what the House did, and then I also have this Senate bill on the side. Sorry for my dog, if you can hear her. Basically, we got what we want. We got the 10% in the surface transportation program. The rec trails, there was a bill for rec trails to fully fund rec trails. That would have worked out to 125 to 150 million, and they basically got that in the House bill starting in 2022. And then for that split between the state pot and the population pot, we wanted 2/3 population, 1/3 state. We got that. And you can see how it compares to the Senate. So that we were really happy with. So that we got. The next part we were looking for was for state flexibility. We want states to be able to offer 5% of their surface transportation, 5% of their transportation alternatives money for technical assistance. We wanted to make it easier to get the local match, including being able, if you're doing a safety project, to use safety dollars as the local match. So it would be 100% federally funded. We also know that there are some states, particularly out west, who would rather just sub-allocate 100% of their transportation alternatives. Those were the things we asked for. We got all of those. And as you can see, we got all of them in the Senate bill, so that's going to make it really easy when it comes to bargaining. So when we're talking about local control, two things. The large metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs, they get a chunk of money and they can award the projects. They get to choose the projects, but they don't have the authority to implement it, to write the contracts, get the money out there, which means they don't have the obligation authority. We want them to have obligation authority. We also know that smaller metropolitan planning organizations, those with populations between 50 and 200,000, they, just because of a technical issue, a drafting error, they were cut out of the Transportation Alternatives Program. We wanted them put back in. We got both of those. Large MPOs can now obligate, they can, which we think if they can implement those projects, they can get them on the ground faster than having to wait for the state. So then the last thing we wanted to take on was this transferability. So the three things I've shown you, the state flexibility, local control, and funding, that was in both the Senate bill and the House bill. We got just about everything we asked. There's a few differences between the bills, but that was great. When we went to the House, we also wanted to take on this issue about states being able to transfer 50% out of transportation alternatives. And this is a tricky one because states can transfer 50% of any program right now. And so asking to be special could be a problem, or we were afraid that would be a problem. The way we approached it with transportation alternatives is that, hey, the goal of this program is to get money to local governments. So states shouldn't be able to transfer the money before they've asked the local governments if they have projects. So that's what we did. Our ask was to require states to run a competitive process, ask local governments for applications, offer technical assistance to local governments that want it, and then at the end certify that there's no suitable applications left before they can transfer the money. So what the House Transportation Committee did is they took all of that language and they put it in the bill, but they also limited how much states can transfer. So instead of being able to transfer 50% of transportation alternatives, this only allows them to transfer 50% of the state funds. So state funds went from 50% to 34%. They can only transfer 50% of that 34%, so 17%, which is great. We were excited to see that. The other thing that's in the Transportation Alternatives Bill is that MPOs can flex 50% of their transportation alternatives money to any project eligible under the larger program. We didn't put that in the bill because we just haven't seen MPOs use that, but the House went further than we had and made those same requirements that they did to the state. So before an MPO can flex, they have to run a competitive process, offer technical assistance, certify there's no applications out there. So we were really happy with that. They made a couple of other changes. One, in terms of eligible entities, states right now under the FAST Act, states are not eligible. This would allow states to apply when they are invited by an eligible entity. So that is because sometimes we see really small communities, they want to do a project, but they can't get the match, they don't want to write the application. They could then say, hey state, would you apply for this project for us? I think that's a pretty good use. They also want to make eligible for local governments the idea of doing a vulnerable road user assessment. And I'll talk about what that is in a little bit. The other thing is right now, states are required to report their projects and how much they cost. But we ask that they also, or what this bill does, which was also in our bill, is it will require that they send the list of projects that they funded, both the year that they awarded it and the year they obligated it. So we'll know that for sure. The other thing it did was list eligibilities. So, and that is important for Safe Routes to School because a lot of states didn't, the way the bill is written in the FAST Act, it says projects that were eligible the day before the FAST Act was signed. So if you want to know what's eligible, you have to go back to the last bill, which was MAP 21. MAP 21 says Safe Routes to School is eligible based on the language that was in Safety Lou. So some states haven't gone all the way back 3 bills to find out that they're eligible. So now they're, not only are the eligibilities there, but the House brought back the Safe Routes to School program. They extended it to high schools. The Safe Routes to School program requires a full-time coordinator at the DOT. That is required here, but it doesn't come out of TAP money. It comes out of either the safety money or the STP money. That also reestablishes the Safe Routes to School clearinghouse, and that is funded by the Office of the Secretary of Transportation and their admin funding. So that's in there, and it doesn't come out of TA. So I think that's great. All right. Also know we had supported the initiative by Rails to Trails Conservancy, the Connecting America's Active Transportation program. The goal of that program was to create a grant program for communities to apply for, oops, did I go, I went one, there we go. The goal was to apply for, to build an entire network out within a community or to build a spine connecting to communities. It's in the bill. It is for 1 year, so it will come into effect in 2024. It's for $250 million in that 1 year. So the networks are eligible, the spines are eligible, and there's planning grants, including complete streets plans, are eligible. The funding will be for not less than $15 million for construction projects, not less than $100,000 for plans, and the grant considerations. One of the things this bill does that other bills haven't is it's very explicit in what the Secretary of Transportation needs to consider when giving a grant. And so in this, well, it's substantially new opportunities for biking and walking, include an inclusive public comment process, consider environmental justice and equity impacts, address vulnerable user safety, and connect to transit. So the good news about it being in 2024 is that it gives you as a community time to plan and get your network plan up to date. The bad news is we probably won't have the results yet when we go to write the next bill. So I'm going to move into safety. There's a number of things in the safety section. First, I want to talk about what they did to complete streets. In the FAST Act, there is a requirement that National Highway System roads consider the safety of all modes. But that's all it says. Like I said, the past bill was not as prescriptive. This bill is a lot more prescriptive. It it frames the requirements in terms of context-sensitive design, which is similar to complete streets. In that, what I mean by prescriptive is it requires the US DOT to provide guidance. So they have to provide best practices. They have to create metrics on how well a project fits in with land use and housing. That's the context-sensitive part of it. It has to describe how to more effectively combine modes in an integrated facility. You know, and we've been talking about needing to rebalance our streets. This is Congress telling the secretary, you need to tell states how to rebalance their streets. And it requires the US Department of Transportation to establish model policies and procedures to implement a context-sensitive design and complete streets project. And within all of those, the secretary needs to ensure that they emphasize that it works for users of all ages and abilities, identified types and designs of projects, have local cooperation, identify what the barriers were and how to overcome them. So it's all the things that when you look at the National Complete Streets Coalition and their list of things that should be in a complete streets policy, it's basically all here saying that if you're building a road with federal aid funds, you need to include these things. Okay, so moving on to the Highway Safety Improvement Program. This was our big ask. We wanted to create systems change around safety. What they did first, they increased eligible projects. So Safer to School projects are now eligible, both the infrastructure and the non-infrastructure. Vision Zero plans and projects are eligible. And they actually go into what should be in a plan, and that includes ensuring that the benefits are equitable across communities. It ensures that, or the plan has to say how the community is going to ensure that enforcement is done equitably, doesn't violate civil rights, and it has a report requirement that you're going to report back, enforce the enforcement and all of the demographics in aggregate. So it makes Vision Zero plans, I think they call them Towards Zero Death plans, but they're Vision Zero plans. It lays out what should be in a plan, and it's a really good model for that. That was a Blumenauer ask that we worked with them on. There's new pedestrian things that are eligible, and overall non-infrastructure projects are now eligible for the Highway Safety Improvement Program again, which is great because we know a lot of states have used that money to fund biking and walking advocacy groups on bicycle education, school education, that sort of thing. So the way the Highway Safety Improvement Program works is that in order to fund a program, it has to be in your strategic highway safety plan. So this bill also requires the plan to include a vulnerable road user assessment. So VRU, vulnerable road user assessment, that's bicyclists, pedestrians, people using mobility devices, that kind of thing. It also requires that the plan address the role of excessive design speeds and speed limits and addresses a safe system approach. And they have a definition of what that means, but looking at the whole system, making sure it's safe for everyone. So the league ask on safety was basically, if you have an area that has a high rate of fatalities for bicyclists and pedestrians, then the state should have to spend some of their safety money on it. That was the 3040 of the Safe Streets Act. What we got in the Senate bill, we got a new pot of money to HSIP, much of which was suballocated, which means the MPOs were getting pieces of it. And it said that if you're a state with a high rate of fatalities, then you have to spend all of your money, all of this new money on biking and walking safety. If you are an urbanized area with a population of 50,000 or more, and you have a high rate of fatalities, then you have to spend that share, or the state has to spend a share of their money on bike ped safety in your area. So that's just a review. What the House did is it says in the first 2 years of the bill, of the new language, the state has to do a vulnerable road user assessment. Starting in 2024, they have to implement that assessment, and that the states that are above the median in terms of, and they didn't just do fatalities, they do fatalities and serious injuries per capita. So if you are above that median, then you have to use some of your surface transportation program funds on vulnerable road user safety. And that amount is equal to half of your transportation alternative funds right now. So it's a little bit interesting in that it's pulling in funds from another program. One of the reasons it does that, surface transportation is a highly valued program from the state DOT. The safety money is less valued. So the idea is if you don't address bike ped safety, if you are above the average, you have to spend, you have to obligate, which means you have to sign the contract, your favorite money on bike ped safety. So it's an incentive to use your safety money on bike ped safety. What's in a road user assessment? You have to look at the location of every fatality and serious injury, look at the design speed on the road. You have to identify the corridors that are of high risk and the design speed and the speed limit of those roads. And then you have to come up with a program of projects or strategies to reduce the safety of vulnerable users. And where those areas are in MPOs or within local governments, you have to consult with them in doing it. And you have to address the safe systems approach when you do that. So quick analysis of that, we think the assessment is great because it requires the state to come up with a plan and it creates a transparency. So if you are with a state advocacy organization, your state is going to have to tell you, this is what we need to do for bike ped safety. And so you can look at that and you can be part of that process in creating the plan. You can, then hold them to that. The bill also includes consequences for states that don't address safety. So in the Safe Streets bill or in the Senate bill, we say, hey, you have to set aside this money for biking and walking. But as we all know, states can set aside that money and never use it. This bill requires that that money is obligated, that it is used. And again, it takes this surface transportation program, their favorite money, that's highly valued, and says, if you don't address safety, we're going to force you to use some of that money on this. I do have some concerns, though, in that the metropolitan areas are not part of the process, and that you could have a state that has an overall low fatality rate, like Idaho, but maybe Boise has a high fatality rate and has some safety issues. Boise doesn't get any money to use this. And so that's one of the things we're thinking about as a change. And I'm not sure, will the same states always be in the top 10? So they always get money, and will the bottom states never have an incentive? And the question is, we're hoping that it will change how they use safety dollars, but not sure because it doesn't actually apply to safety. So here's how the three proposals line up. For us, I mean, we said proportional, which is a lot closer to the old fair share for safety. But because both the House and Senate are about that $250 million, we should expect to get that in a bill if the invest bill pass. Probably would prefer come out of safety, but honestly, we want the money spent. Really love the idea of requiring it be obligated. I like the idea of the fatalities and injuries included. We did like what the Senate did in terms of the state and urbanized areas being included. Because that ensures that some money gets down to the MPOs and that they're part of that decision making. Really like the vulnerable road user assessment. Would love to see this program start in the first year, not later. Okay, so I'm gonna just check on some questions that are related to safety. Okay. So I got a question. Any idea what will be used for describing the types of infrastructure? That'll be up to the DOT, but DOT has that bikeway selection guide that has a great set of ideas in there. These slides will be made available. So we'll do that. Okay, so that's the questions I'm seeing right now on safety. I'm gonna move on to performance measures, planning, and MPOs. Okay, some exciting news here. One, the bill creates 2 new performance measures, one to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so both states and MPOs will have to come up with a goal. Under that, there'll have to be one for carbon dioxide, what the carbon dioxide emissions from public roads per capita for the state or the MPO, and then it leaves it up to DOT to pick another greenhouse gas. It also includes another one to improve access to jobs and services. And that includes all modes. It specifically calls out low-income folks. So how well can people get from where they live to where they work, from where they live to health service, from where they live to grocery stores? So we're very happy to see both of those. Having that performance measure is much stronger than that pilot program we got in the Senate bill. They also do something to performance measures, which doesn't sound radical, but it's going to sound radical to the people that have to set the performance measures. You can't have a regressive goal. So this is the safety performance measure for New Jersey on non-motorized fatalities. And they said, hey, between 2013 and 2017, our average was 378 fatalities and serious injuries. In 5 years, our goal is to be at 394 fatalities or serious injuries. And they argue, yes, it's going up, but our trend line is slowing. So our rate of increase is slowing. The House bill says, you can't just reduce the rate of increase. You have to actually reduce the number of fatalities and serious injuries. And that is huge. And there are funding consequences if you don't. Okay. Moving into planning for both MPO and statewide planning. They both now have to set performance measures for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and for improving access to jobs and services. Again, the jobs and services is all modes focused on transit dependent and low income. They also have to do a vulnerability assessment of infrastructure. That means vulnerability to natural disasters and climate change. And it has to look over the life of the facility, and it has to focus on evacuation routes. It also, it's also going to have to deal with transit dependent and low income. The projects listed in that plan, and then if you list plan, then you're eligible for these 2 new programs that have been created. And finally, there's language on the public process. We saw this with the Connecting America's active transportation, but throughout the bill, in almost every grant program, there's this emphasis on the public process, ensuring it's inclusive and that they're creative in how they make sure people can be part of that process, and that the projects consider environmental justice and the equity impacts. Another interesting thing on the MPO makeup, again, the MPO is the Metropolitan Planning Organization. For all metro areas of 50,000 or more, they have MPOs. Right now, most of those are set up so that every city or community has one representative. So in the Washington, D.C. one, D.C. has one, Arlington, Virginia has one, Homo Park has one, in Maryland, that kind of thing. They put in language here that says they have to consider the equitable and proportional representation of the population when they are appointing existing officials and representatives. So that's really interesting. They say that MPOs that are already formed don't have to change. It's only new or redesignated MPOs. So it'd be interesting to see how this changes. But I'm interested. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I think that some of those larger cities and those MPOs will be very happy to see it. Okay, going on to climate programs. 3 new programs: the Predisaster Mitigation Program, Carbon Pollution Reduction Program for states, Community Climate Innovation Grants for communities, local governments. We already talked about the performance measure. Just to note that there's also changes in the transit and rail program. So the pre-disaster mitigation program, this is basically, we talked about needing to have that vulnerability plan. Once you have that plan, this is the program that funds those things. They're looking to improve resiliency. You can relocate infrastructure if you need to. You can look at how to improve the operation of your evacuation route, whether that means technology, communications, that kind of stuff. Interestingly, it includes building shoulders on those roads, so that's good to know for biking and walking. The carbon pollution reduction program, this is 8.3 billion, so this is as big as, say, the safety or CMAQ, probably bigger. Eligibilities, projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Biking and walking is in the first eligibility, and that's exciting because we're eligible for all these programs. Just in general, we're eligible for all transportation programs, but we're rarely the first thing listed. But it's listed here, transit and intercity rail. It does allow communities to use up to 10% of it for transit, for operations, so bus drivers, keeping the buses moving, if they can show that it's reducing GHG. Program does not allow any single occupancy vehicle capacity. You can't build any new SOV lanes. And here's what's interesting in it. This is another one of those performance management things. The USDOT is going to rank the states based on how well they are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So they're going to look at their emissions from the most recent data, the most recent year, versus their annual emissions from 2015 to 2019. The states that have the highest reduction, they're rewarded. They can use these funds to do 100% federally funded projects, so they don't have to kick in the 20%, and they can transfer 50% of this program to another project if they want. The bottom 15 states, however, they are going to, again, have to pull from that surface transportation program funds. They must use 10% of that on these programs or on projects that reduce GHG. There is a thing in there so that if a state has actually reduced its greenhouse gas emissions, but it's still within the bottom 15, which would be great because that means that more than 35 states are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. If that's the case, then they don't get penalized. But if their GHG stays the same, if their emissions either stays the same or goes up, then they're going to have to use some of their flexible money, some of their favorite money on carbon pollution reduction. At the community level, it's a grant program, the maximum of 25 million per project, same sort of eligibilities, no single occupancy vehicle capacity is allowed. Again, they're looking for things that reduce SOV travel, create other options, connectivity and accessibility for bike-led transit, all good things, how it serves low-income communities, and is a diversity of urban, suburban, rural programs, and again has that language about public process, equity, and environmental justice. So those are some really big changes. I am going to go through some of these other federal aid programs, and then I'll look for questions again before we get to the NHTSA pieces. Okay, so federal lands, again, we really did want to see a set aside for active transportation. We did not get that, but this bill increases, it gives a 40% increase to the formula funding, to the funding for federal land. So that's national parks, that's Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife, all those things. Their funding got cut, I think, in 2012 significantly, and they've been starved for funding. So this is really good. And by the way, that's the argument they give us against the set aside, is that we just need to focus on basic repairs. There's a new eligibility in the Federal Lands Transportation Program where if a park or a BLM, entity says, hey, we are really getting affected because the state's not taking care of this other road that we don't have any control over. There's now a process for them to go to the state and say, hey, we really need that road fixed. And if you just give us the money, we'll do it. Or if you give the money to USDOT, they'll do it. It'll be interesting to see how that works. They also created a grant program for major projects. The federal lands programs and the tribal lands programs, or projects, they don't generally compete very well in another project built for this. So they built their own $12.5 million minimum if it's stuff that they're just having difficulty doing under the regular programs. So I gave it half a bike because I think better transportation in general in our national parks might make it easier. Hopefully will encourage some parks in some of these areas to do some more bike and walking active trans pieces. Congestion mitigation and air quality, not a lot of changes, but they do make bike share and scooter share projects eligible. They also changed the transferability. So remember when I said that every program can transfer 50% to another program? Well, that's how it works now under CMAQ. Under this INVEST Act, you can transfer your CMAQ, but you can only transfer it to the carbon pollution reduction program. So either way, you're not going to be building single occupancy vehicle roads. Either way, a bike ped transit are going to be more effective. You're going to be having to look at reducing emissions. Remember we talked about the Connecting America's Active Transportation Program being available for 1 year? What they did is they had a bunch of grant programs they wanted to fund, couldn't fund them all, so they gave 4 of them 1 year. The Active Transportation, the Gridlock Reduction Program, which is for urbanized areas of 1 million or more, to get a big chunk of money, 10 to 50 million. It's all for things that reduce congestion. Bike ped is definitely eligible. Transit is eligible. That's sort of a top use. It's similar to the Senate Congestion Program. There's also a rural program, same idea. It's got a $25 million ceiling on those projects, but to get a state or local entity can apply to do a project in their area. The 4th one was commercial vehicle parking. They also created this program, see if this sounds familiar to anybody, with goals of safety, state of good repair, accessibility, environmental quality, $25 million max. The idea is to fund multimodal or multi-jurisdictional projects that don't come through in any other way. If it sounds familiar, this is basically authorizing the Tiger or the Build, what is now the Build program within the Tiger program. Couple of differences. One, they took out economic development as one of the goals. And 2, it's a very strict evaluation process. Like I said in the past, they basically said, hey, USDOT, here's the things it should do. Tell us what you pick. But this gets a lot more prescriptive in that it requires the USDOT to create a numerical value for every project on each of these top goals. And then they have to be completely transparent on how many points each project got, what the weighting of those different goals were, and what the decisions were. And then finally, I want to talk about the National Highway Performance Program. This is a program I rarely talk about in these webinars because this is mostly used to build the big roads, the interstate, big NHS roads. Very little of this money goes to biking and walking. A lot of it goes to new construction. This is probably one of the most radical changes in the bill. They put in a policy that says you cannot use the National Highway Performance Program to build any new single occupancy vehicle capacity. So you can't just go out and build a new road, unless you meet a couple of things. And this is going to be difficult. One, they have a fix it first policy. So your state has to have demonstrated progress in achieving a state of good repair. So that is also a performance measure. If you're not doing well on that, no single occupancy vehicle lanes with this money. Number 2, you have to demonstrate that that project supports the achievement of the performance targets, including greenhouse gases, accessibility, all that, and that it's more cost effective than if you did an operational improvement. So that might be changing lighting, or you did a construction project, or you did something else to improve freight movement. Like, you have to show that the only way to meet the goals of that project is to build new roads. And why I say this might be the biggest change in the bill is that this program that we rarely talk about because we rarely get any money is basically, it's 50% or even a little more. I think it was 55% in the FAST Act of all of the surface transportation dollars. So they're saying the biggest chunk of money, you can't build lanes capacity for single occupancy vehicles. So that is really huge. All right, gonna take a quick break for questions before we get on to NHTSA programs. So question, could we push for the vulnerable road user assessment as a pilot project in the first bill? I think you mean in the first year? We could think about it. I need to talk to the sponsor of the Safe Streets bill and talk to the committee and see what where they are on safety to see if we want to do something. So I got a question about, does a small RPO, which is basically a regional planning organization that's in a rural area, does it fit somewhere in that planning MPO statewide process? Those are usually part of the statewide plan. I got a question about what happens if states tie in the ranking. My guess is they either get the benefit or they get the consequence. So got a question on the National Highway program. Can they rebuild the road and add dedicated toll or transit lanes? I think if they were adding a lane that has then certainly a transit lane, I think that would work. I'm not sure about the toll lanes. We'll have to see what happens with that. Okay, so I know that's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of changes. I want to talk a little bit about the NHTSA programs because there's some interesting things in this as well. So the 402, 405 fundings, this is the money that goes to the Governor Highway Safety Association or organization. Every state has one. Sometimes they're connected to DOTs, sometimes they're not. This is another place to go for education money, things like that. So the 402 program, which is sort of a larger program, it used to prohibit the use of automatic safety enforcement, so speed cameras, safety cameras, red light cameras, whatever you want to call them. It now will allow states to use some of that money in school zones or work zones to put cameras in those areas. That's a big change. I know NACDA wanted to do that in HSIP, but they got it here, so they're cracking the door open on those safety cameras. The 405 program is where it's priority programs. So there is some priority funding for biking and walking education in this. This adds a new one. It adds a driver and law enforcement education to help reduce the potential for conflicts during traffic stops. They also in 405 wanted to lift up some programs they feel are really effective but haven't been used. So ignition, interlocks, a lot of this is going to drunk and distracted driving. Enacting and enforcing state distracted driving laws and implementing state graduated driver's licensing laws. So all of those things I think are really good. We would love to see them enacted and used a little more. I think that would be really good. For anyone who's ever tried to use the NHTSA site on 402 and 405 programs, it's very difficult to find out what your state has done. They are requiring a more usable, searchable website, which I think will make Ken McLeod very happy. They also create some research grants. One is in traffic safety enforcement. So they're looking specifically, it's 10 states, and it's so that they can implement some proven counter safety measures that get 3 to 5 stars. So they're in the higher value ones of the NHTSA counter safety measures. So they're going to see if they work. There's funding, I think, for 10 states to go try to implement that. One of the things I'm excited about is the uniform reporting requirement so that we can compare across states. They also have funding for a program to prohibit racial profiling. And so that it funds states to collect the data that would be necessary to study that, to look at options, and to make all of that public. So I think that's also really exciting. And then I want to talk about AV and technology, because as I said, this committee doesn't write the AV automated vehicles. They don't write the bill regulating automated vehicles, but they do talk about how automated vehicles interplay with the roads. So one of the things that they'll have is they're changing the goals of some of these programs from just accelerating deployment of automated vehicles, just getting them out there, to ensuring that when they are deployed, they increase safety and mobility. And we had worked with one of our partners to add eligibility for vehicle to pedestrian technologies. So that's something for someone with a disability. They would be able to get to an intersection, go on their phone and say, hey, I'm here, and change the lights, make sure they have enough time to walk across. Another way that could work is a camera on the infrastructure could say, hey, there's a bunch of bikes coming, and they could send that information to a car. And the car would, maybe not the driver, but the car would know there's bicyclists coming, and stop. So we think that's really good. They also include that vehicle road safety as a priority and greenhouse gas reductions as a priority. There's a intelligent transportation system program with the goal to enhance the efficiency of the transportation system through technology. And they just changed that advisory board to ensure that there's a bicycle and pedestrian representative on it. Also, within the National Highway Automated Vehicle and Mobility Innovation Clearinghouse, sorry, long name. This was another Blumenauer bill that we were supportive of. This basically creates a clearinghouse at a university to study the effects of automated vehicles and related technologies. It's supposed to be on secondary issues, so things like land use and housing. I know one of the things local governments are concerned about is parking revenue. What is it, if no one ever parks illegally, what is that going to do to their budget? So this is a place to sort of study all that stuff before it happens and in the early stages so that we're prepared. They also included a study on the safe interactions between automated vehicles and road users, with a specific focus on vulnerable users, people biking and walking. I think it's great that they're looking at it. A lot of that is not happening in the other committee that's writing the bills, or not happening to our satisfaction. So this is another outlet for that. It will also require that biking and walking advocates be in the working group and be able to oversee that study. So very happy to see a lot of these changes. We think it's a really great bill. It's a really innovative bill. In some ways, some of those things that reduce single occupancy vehicle drivers and push states to really consider greenhouse gas emissions, even though it's not specifically a bike bill, or set aside for biking. I think a lot of that is really going to help what we want and what we do. If you think about the transportation funding as a pie, we could either increase the whole pie and increase our slice as part of that, or we could look at changing the pie so that we just get a bigger slice of what's already there, and we actually change how the rest of the pie looks. And that's what this bill does. And I think that has been a real goal, that systems change of the league. So I'm gonna check again for questions. So a question, any chance that projects that would have applied for the National Highway Performance Program shift into and clog up the other programs? So they're run, that's a good question. I mean, the state likes to use this program because it's just about building roads. If it goes into another, they either have to prove that there's a safety benefit, they have to prove that there's a climate benefit. They could use their surface transportation program money on this kind of thing because that's really flexible, but there's a lot of demands on that money. I'll also say, I didn't talk about it here, but there is a bridge program where you're required to address your, I'm missing the term, but bridges that are not meeting the standards. So I've got a question, can bicycle-friendly driver training be covered in 402 and 405? Yes, it's definitely can be covered in 405, and I believe it can be covered in 402 as well. Okay. I've got a question. It's been very hard to see data on the NHTSA org. I think you mean the Government Highway Safety Organization in the state. Federal level wouldn't share performance data on how shares are doing. Yes, so some of the new rules on that website is they have to be clear on what those goals are within the Government Highway Safety Organization and where the state is. So that is one of the things that they're hoping to address. And a correction, there's an off-system bridge requirement that they address those. All right. Just quickly on the next steps, again, we already talked about this, but we're going to be watching for amendments, both amendments we like and amendments we don't like moving forward. So please take a look for league action alerts, watch our e-news, sign up if you haven't already. You know, before this bill came out, I was worried that because it was not bipartisan, we would get attacked on transportation alternatives because biking and walking was a very partisan issue back in 2012. It hasn't been. I think there's a lot of other things in this bill that may get attacked before transportation alternatives, but there's a lot in here that we want to protect and we want to support, and there may be some changes. So please keep watching for that. I also want to talk about Ways and Means, because I think we have a good chance of getting the Bicycle Commuter Act into law, and I'll be reaching out to folks who are in a state or a district of someone who's on the Ways and Means Committee. We're going to try to do a sign-on letter to get the bicycle commuter benefit. So please look for that. We really need some help on that. You know, the bill looks great for us. We'd love to get that in as well. And then this was from my last webinar. And I said, you know, T&I needs to happen in June in order to make the rest of everything else fall in place. It's happening. This bill came out yesterday morning, and today the Senate is talking about we need to do our transportation bill. Like they're all about trying to get the banking and commerce titles going. So I think we are going to have that competitiveness going, and hopefully we can actually get a bill, hopefully by the end of September, but at least by the end of the year. All right, I think. All right, so I'm done. If you have any additional questions, you can put them in the chat box now, or you can email me at karen@bikeleague.org. And I'll be there. I will mention, I did see there's a question about e-bikes. E-bikes are defined in this bill, but they are defined as class 1 and 2. They have the 20 miles per hour limit on that. So that's another thing. People for bikes may be working on an amendment. We'll have to see what happens with that. But for the first time, e-bikes got defined in transportation law. They've been in other law. Bike share is also, like I said, it's eligible in CMAQ. It's also eligible in transit. So with that, I'll sign off. Thanks for joining me. Let me know if you have any questions, and please, please, please look for those sign-on letters, look for those action alerts. We'd really like to get the best bill as possible going into conference with the Senate. Thank you.